Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this ISS seminar, Leading Through Consensus, South Africa Chairs the African Union. I would like to thank all of you for attending this seminar, including representatives of South African government, civil society organizations, embassies, academia and media. We would also like to thank the audience that is following the seminar online through our website. Thank you for those of you that have traveled to Pretoria on this wonderful rainy morning to be with us, and for taking some time from your busy schedule to join us in what we expect to be a lively and interactive discussion. ISS's work on South African foreign policy aims to support strengthening South Africa's responses to peace, security and development in Africa, focusing on key areas of engagement of the country in the continent. The ISS makes important investments to actively engage, follow and support South Africa as it wears multiple hats in multilateral platforms. This work has been conducted through extensive fieldwork, timely publications, and targeted advice to government officials. This project is funded by the UK government via DFID in South Africa, for which we are, as always, very thankful. Our work during the last number of years has focused on priorities for the country, including SADC, the role of South Africa and in Burundi, and extensive work on maritime security. Over the last 2 years, the ISS particularly focused to support South Africa's tenure as a member of the UN Security Council for the period 2019 and 2020. Considering the importance of the African Union to South Africa's foreign policy, this seminar is part of the work of the ISS to support an effective South African chairship of the African Union in 2020. It complements the direct support the ISS provides to the African Union through the Training for Peace program, funded by the Norwegian government for the last 25 years, when the AU was still the OAU. This is designed to strengthen the African Union Commission's work on governance, peace and security. Therefore, this seminar is an opportunity to link two critical areas of the ISS's work, namely South Africa and the African Union. The aim of the seminar is to present the findings and recommendations of the policy brief, Leading by Consensus, South Africa Chairs the African Union, authored by our ISS colleagues Liesel Louw-Woudren and Mohammed Diatta, within the context of our South African foreign policy support. This policy brief analyzes the rotating position of the chair of the African Union, its prerogatives and practice during the recent years. The policy brief, in particular, is targeted at assessing the expectations of South Africa's chairship, focusing on opportunities and challenges that the country may face, and provide targeted recommendations to help the country to have a successful tenure as the AU's chair. For this occasion, we have 4 fantastic speakers. Firstly, researchers Mohammed Diatta from our Addis office, Mohammed, and Liesel Louw-Woudren, senior researcher from our office in Pretoria, will share some of their key findings and recommendations based on their research and how South Africa can maximize its chairship of the African Union in 2020. We also deem it important to share views from Addis Ababa and South Africa. Therefore, we ask Nshal Ndeje Michelle, Director of the Africa Peace and Security Program at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies, IPSS, in Addis Ababa, to share some of her perspectives from the Addis Ababa focus. Then she will be followed by Aditi Lalbahudur, Aditi, to share some South African perspectives. Both these organizations are close partners of the ISS and will provide their perspectives on the theme. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Gustavo de Carvalho, Senior Researcher at the ISS, that will be moderating the discussions. I would like to wish you fruitful discussions, and notwithstanding that you might not like the rain, we really hope it will continue raining for another week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annette. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. As introduced by Annette, I'm Gustavo de Carvalho, and I'll be moderating this session. I don't want to extend much on these remarks, especially I think most have been covered by Annette, but particularly to give a segue to our four fantastic speakers on the importance of this discussion, but also in terms of the timing of this discussion. We're in December 2019, and soon South Africa will take over the chairship of the African Union from Egypt. There is a number of questions, opportunities, expectations, excitements, fears that we all share regarding how the country can maximize its roles within the African Union, but particularly how a country like South Africa can continue strengthening the role of our most important continental organization. One of the big things in our field is how do we deal with flexibility. So we took some liberties this morning to change somehow the agenda that you have received and are in your folders, particularly in terms of the order of the speakers. We're going to start with Mohammed from ISS Addis Ababa office, which will share some thoughts and views around the policy brief that has just been completed and all of you have in your folders, together with some other publications from the ISS. Lizo will continue with some further thoughts, analysis, and recommendations on what have been some of the findings from the research, the extensive research that has been done both in Pretoria, Addis, and other places. And we will then follow by Michelle from IPSS, which will share some views from Addis Ababa, concluding by Aditi from SAIA that will have some final thoughts. We will then, as Annette mentioned, this is has been live streamed online, and this part of the discussion is not Chatham House rules. It is an open discussion, and quoting can be done without the permission of the authors. However, we will then close the web streaming after the presentations to allow a closed discussion under Chatham House rules. So we know there is some members of the media here, so if any comment has been made in the Q&A session, please ask whoever made it for the authorization and permission to make those quotes. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Mohammed. Each of the speakers will talk for around 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you, Gustavo. Very short. Okay, thanks a lot, Gustavo. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming to this seminar, where the idea for us is really to share some of the findings from our research. Maybe to give a little bit of background to the policy brief, Liesl and myself work on what we call the Peace and Security Council report, which is a monthly publication of the ISS that focuses on the Peace and Security Council of the African Union as well as the African Union in general. So with South Africa getting ready to chair the African Union next year, we thought it would be timely for us to produce something on some sort of reflection on the matter, sort of to leverage our understanding of the African Union. From my side, I just want to share some of the key analysis and findings from the policy brief, and I want to focus on three major aspects of the policy brief. The number one aspect is simply to discuss what is the chair of the African Union supposed to do? What are the prerogatives of chairing the African Union? There are a lot of assumptions out there about what the chair is supposed to do and not supposed to do. So we really wanted to look into it. The second thing I want to share is the experience from both Rwanda and Egypt as chair of the Union in 2018, and this year Egypt was chairing the African Union. And lastly, the last thing I want to share is the expectations, some of the expectations from Addis Ababa in particular, the exchanges that we've had with the diplomatic and NGO community in Addis, and what they think South Africa can do next year. So in terms of the institutional and legal framework, with regards to what the chair of the African Union is supposed to do, this is essentially outlined in three key documents. Number one is the AU Constitutive Act. The second document, which sets out what the chair of the union can do, is the rules of procedures of the AU Assembly. So the AU Assembly is simply the collection of all 55 heads of states and governments of the African Union, and those rules of procedures also have some provisions as to what the chair is supposed to do. And lastly, and interestingly, the role of the chair of the union is also discussed in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. In more details, the AU Constitutive Act basically states that the chair of the union represents the union and has the duty to promote the objectives and principles of the union. He or she also has to represent the union between ordinary sessions of the organization. And what is interesting about what the Constitutive Act says regarding the role of the chair of the union is that the objectives and principles of the union are wide, in a sense that it covers different themes, aspects, and this essentially gives the chairperson of the African Union room to act on a variety of issues. So to give you a clear example, some of the principles, some of the objectives of the union, for instance, accelerate political and socio-economic integration. This essentially means that as the chair of the African Union, you are able to work on anything that falls within the framework of socio-economic integration. Other objectives of the union include promoting democratic institutions, popular participation, and good governance, the promotion and protection of human rights. So essentially, if you are the chair of the union and your prerogatives include the promotion of those objectives, then you would be technically allowed to pick up on issues of good governance, on issues of democratic institutions, on issues of popular participation, as well as issues of human rights. In terms of principles, Article 4 of the Constitutive Act obviously states out those very clearly. You have the promotion of self-reliance of the continent, the promotion of gender equality. Article 4H, which is one of the innovation with the Constitutive Act in 2002, which is the right of the Union to intervene in a member state. So this also means that as a chair of the African Union, you typically would have a say in a particular situation, typically something that has to do with peace and security, wars, genocide, or human rights violations. So the last principle, obviously, which the AU has actually done very well on, is the condemnation and rejection of unconstitutional changes of governments. So those are some of the objectives and principles of the Union, which the African Union chairperson can pick up on and have a say on, or actually have a plan for the promotion of those different objectives and principles. Now, in terms of concrete power, that I would put it that way, in terms of concrete power that the chair of the Union can have, the rules of procedures of the Assembly clearly state that the chair can give directives to the Executive Council of the African Union, but also to the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. And this is very interesting for those of us working on the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. It is the African organ in charge of peace and security matters on the continent. The Peace and Security meets at least 5 to 8 times a month to discuss peace and security matters on the continent. So these include country situations, the Central African Republic, Sudan, South Sudan, but also regional issues such as the threat of terrorism in the Sahel, or other thematic issues, climate change, the role of women in peace and security, etc., etc. It's a pretty powerful body that has, decision-making power. And for the chair of the African Union to be able to give directives to the Peace and Security Council, it is some substantial power. A concrete example to that, I was going to speak about it a bit later, but this year the Peace and Security Council played a critical role in managing the transition in Sudan, including the exclusion of Sudan from the African Union, the suspension of Sudan rather from the African Union while the transition discussions were going on. So in that instance, we clearly saw both the role of the PSC, but also of the role of the chair of the African Union for this year, which is Egypt. The PSC basically made a decision on Sudan, which was to suspend Sudan and to call for the military to hand over power to civilians in the country. And the chair of the African Union stepped in, called a meeting in Cairo to discuss the issue and what were the appropriate steps to be taken in order to resolve the situation in Sudan. So we could clearly see that there was this back and forth between, on the one end, the chair of the African Union, and on the other end, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, sort of working together but also disagreeing on the way forward for Sudan. So in conclusion, regarding the powers of the chair of the African Union, it is evident that if you look at the institutional legal frameworks of the African Union, chairing the AU gives the chair some room to maneuver and to make decisions and have an impact on a variety of issues facing the continent. So I'll be a little bit brief on Egypt and Rwanda's chairship, what we can learn from them. Quickly speaking about Rwanda, I think what really stands out is that for many people, Rwanda really elevated the position of chair of the union to a level that had not been seen before. And looking into it, what we found was that it was all in, number one, for Rwanda, understanding what the chair of what are the prerogatives of the chair, as I've just explained. So Rwanda understood this very well, that they were able to do a number of things and to push on a variety of priorities of the union. The second thing Rwanda did after that was obviously to plan extremely well and to decide on what they wanted to achieve as chair of the union. So obviously planning cannot be understated in this case. The other very important thing that Rwanda did was to work closely with the African Union Commission based in Addis. Basically, the commission runs the day-to-day activities of the union, and it is absolutely essential to be able to work with them, to get them to implement the decisions that are made by the union. When it comes to Egypt, Egypt also had the same approach. They outlined what their priorities were earlier this year. What I would say about Egypt and about all the other chairs, including South Africa next year, is that as a chair, you only have 1 year. You run the organization for 1 year, and you have very little time to really implement whatever objectives you set out for yourself. And in that, it's also then difficult, even for us researchers, to measure exactly what the achievements have been for some of the chairs. But in any case, Egypt had 6 priorities, which included building bridges among Africa's people. How do you measure that? How do you measure if that was achieved or not? Is a question. Cooperating with partners, economic and regional integration. We can allude to some of the things that Egypt did, such as signing the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which it didn't initially sign. It was a move to show its commitment to a continental project. Economic and social development, peace and security. Egypt is, for instance, setting up the Cairo AU Center for Post-Conflict Reconstruction and Development. They are hosting the Aswan Forum for Sustainable Peace and Security and Development in Africa. This will be this month, actually next week in Egypt. So there are a number of initiatives that Egypt took that can point to, their achievements this year as chair of the union. So I'm being told that I only have 2 minutes, so I need to wrap up. Let me finish with some of the expectations in terms of South Africa's chairship next year. I mean, talking to people in Addis Ababa, it's basically 2 camps. There are people who are optimistic as to what South Africa can achieve. They believe that South Africa has the necessary gravitas to push on some of the burning and important issues facing the continent, such as pushing for the actual implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is meant to be launched next week, next year in June 2020. There are also people who are confident that South Africa has the necessary power to push for the institutional reforms of the African Union, especially the Commission. There are also people who are more skeptical, who believe that, and I don't know whether that's a fair comment or not, but that South Africa will not do much more than the others have done, and they typically would link that to the performance of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma as chair of the African Union Commission. Although the two positions are completely different positions. On the one hand, she was chairing the commission, and here we are talking about chairing the union. So in any case, we have those sort of two views on what South Africa can achieve. And I'll finish with that just in 30 seconds. The biggest challenge in our view that comes out from the research is really South Africa's image at the moment, because of what we witnessed in the country, the xenophobic attacks against African nationals in the country. And the reactions in Addis Ababa were quite strong for the first time. I mean, it wasn't the first time that this happened in South Africa, but I think it was probably the first time that there was unanimous condemnation and outrage from African diplomats in Addis, and I think this will be, in our view, one of the biggest challenge that Africa will face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And I'm not going to really try to summarize this presentation, but really to bring you some ideas of what we can use later in our discussions. But using, particularly from one of the first questions that Mohammed brought to us, what is the chair of the African Union supposed to do? And often there is a question when we interact here in Pretoria that we need to balance out in terms of the expectations for South Africa as the chair, but particularly what is the realm of the chair of the African Union, what can be done, what are the capabilities, both in terms of their own role as a country like South Africa, but the capabilities of the chair. I think the examples brought by Mohammed in terms of the role of Rwanda and Egypt are very important. Rwanda, in a way, and paraphrasing what Mohammed said in terms of elevating, at least within the public opinion and people like ourselves following closely the African Union, but also how will South Africa interact in this handover process between Egypt and the country. So using that and maybe giving the floor already to Lizo and to asking the question, what really can South Africa do and what can we expect South Africa to achieve next year in their chairship process? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gustavo. I see the room slowly, very quickly actually filling up because of the rain and all the traffic jams that we've seen. Thank you very much for everyone for coming. We're very happy to have our guests from Addis Ababa, including Mohammed and Michelle. So basically, I'm going to very quickly look at South Africa's chairing the AU in the context of our foreign policy and what the priorities are expected to be and what we can realistically achieve, as Mohammed said, in 1 year, really. And to pick up just to what he said by way of introduction, well, South Africa has a lot of experience of the African Union. After all, former President Thabo Mbeki was one of the founders of the AU in 2002, the first chair as well. We had the chairperson, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, from 2012 to early 2017. She was supposed to step down in 2016. And then it was early 2017. We also have a lot of institutional memory of the workings of the African Union. We have our former President Mbeki and others are actually still involved within the AU. But given that we have and South Africa has a lot to offer, this chairship really comes with major constraints, I would say. First of all, it probably doesn't come at the right time for President Cyril Ramaphosa, who has a lot of other things on his plate, internal issues. There is the major issue of xenophobia, and I think we in South Africa tend to underestimate the impact of xenophobia had not only this year, but in fact since 2008, those major attacks that we had, but especially in 2015 when there was really a wake-up call by others on the continent, and we saw South African businesses being targeted. Xenophobia is a recurring problem but these major waves of xenophobic violence, and in September 2019, we saw it coupled with the social media campaigns, or the way social media actually influence reaction in places like Lagos, Lusaka, and elsewhere. Even as Mohammed says, in Addis Ababa, it really tarnishes South Africa's reputation. Now, if you speak to South African officials, of course, they always say, well, it's just a crime, it's not the government's responsibility. And yet the perception out there is that the government is not showing enough commitment to actually fighting xenophobia, protecting foreign nationals in South Africa, and especially when it comes to, I would say, legal refugees and asylum seekers, and this mix that often economic migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of different narratives around that. But basically, I think what officials and other member states of the African Union actually are concerned about is the government's position towards foreign nationals in South Africa. So whether we like it or not, it does have an impact. So there is the issue of, I would say, timing, xenophobia. Also, South Africa has somehow lost its shine as an example of good governance, a sophisticated economy, which still exists, but economic growth in any event. We've been surpassed by others when it comes to economic aspects. And of course, South Africa in the early 2000s had a huge commitment to the African agenda, the African Renaissance, sending troops to DRC, Burundi, elsewhere. We were prioritizing mediation, peace and security efforts across the continent. So that is no longer the case. South Africa does have troops in the eastern DRC. And in actual fact, I will mention it just now, we do a lot of work on the continent behind the scenes. From the government, but NGOs, other institutions, and maybe 2020 will be an occasion to showcase some of those initiatives, which really, South African officials always say to us, we don't want to practice megaphone diplomacy because, we prefer silent diplomacy. It's more successful, and that's an arguable point. But when it comes to your soft power and your influence on the continent, would it not be better perhaps at times to say this is what we've done and this is what we're achieving? So my final point when it comes to the context is also that South Africa has been largely absent from debates within the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa. And I'd like to refer you to a very interesting book that our colleague Eddie Maloka, whom you all know from the African Peer Review Mechanism, has just brought out. And he is very critical of the deployment policies by South Africa which have not been implemented. Eddie, some of you might know, he was an advisor to the minister in the early few years of the Zuma administration. He's now CEO of the APRM, and one of really someone we would have liked to have here, but he couldn't make it. And so he says that South Africa had, there were policies on paper to deploy South African officials to multilateral institutions, the UN, the African Union. But today, others might have more information, but our quotas in any event in the African Union Commission are not filled. And South Africa has not had commissioners at the very high level. So one of the recommendations we are making in the policy brief is to say if South Africa really is committed to the AU, could we not field a candidate for one of the, which will then be 6 AU Commission positions in 2021? Because the process of electing a new commission, the term Musa Faki's commission expires at the end of 2020. So it's one of the issues that we've put out there. So we've been largely absent. There is xenophobia, etc. So now, just very briefly, the priorities, I would like to just focus on silencing the guns, which is the theme for 2020. whether South Africa likes it or not, once again, this decision was made at the summit in Niamey, and others had felt that maybe we could have rather prioritized things like intra-African trade, which is a real priority for South Africa, and we feel is aligned with President Ramaphosa's own priorities also in terms of diplomatic economic diplomacy and growing the South African economy. But nevertheless, there are other priorities that we mentioned in the policy brief, relations between the AU and the UN, because we will still be serving on the UN in 2020, which gives us a very good leverage. I think Gustavo has written a lot about that in 2020. But let me just say, silencing the guns. That is the theme for 2020. What can we do? First prize, I would say, for South Africa would be, in a perfect world, use the convening power of the African Union in order to coordinate and showcase our efforts, not only from government side, as I said, from various actors that have been working over these last few decades in the Central African Republic, in South Sudan, in Zimbabwe, in Madagascar, to then pool all these resources, even business. I mean, that is such a contentious issue because South African businesses are all over the continent, and yet they are not part of this conversation. I mean, when we were chairing SADC, the theme for South Africa was partnering with the private sector in order to drive, I can't remember, development or something. And we saw a few meetings, but not really pushing it to another level in terms of pushing the agendas forward. So that would be the first prize within all these other constraints. And I would say, I mean, we've heard from South African officials these last couple of weeks that South Africa wants fresh initiatives to be able to weigh in on these protracted conflicts like South Sudan, the Central African Republic, Libya, for example, even the Sahel, which is probably a bridge too far for South Africa. And I mean, it's such an intractable problem, but others might have other opinions. South Africa can go beyond just summits and meetings and so on when it comes to specifically this issue of silencing the guns. Of course, we don't have thousands of troops to send to war zones like we might have had in the early 2000s. But many people have written, Laurie Nathan, for example, a well-known South African academic, that said, okay, we have our strength, mediation, the South African example of reconciliation. I mean, behind the scenes, a lot of people are doing good work, and there is even an expectation from certain countries that says, what can we learn from South Africa's model of transition from a conflict, from apartheid to a democracy? How can we establish reconciliation? I know South Africans have given up on that somehow, and the Rainbow Nation and all those notions are old hat. But there are people in Madagascar in the reconciliation unit and in other places in Cote d'Ivoire and so on who are saying, help us. You have a model, and there are experts who've done this, even DDR and issues like that. So within those constraints, we can achieve, we have few troops, but we have still some soft power. I do believe we have examples, we have good people, we have mediation strategies that can help silencing the guns, or as my colleague Peter Fabricius says, not silencing the guns, but bringing the level down a little bit. We won't be able to silence all the guns. So what can we achieve? What are the chances? We are chairing the AU. It is different to just being a member of the South Sudan plus panel. We saw earlier in 2019, for example, the crisis in the DRC. South Africa taking the position behind SADC, because South Africa was not chairing SADC. We, as the ISS, have done a lot of work and written and so on about that controversial decision to say we are a SADC not going to go along with the AU position, which was then to say to the DRC, these are flawed elections, keep it on hold, have another round or recount or something. Of course, as we wrote in the brief, South Africa's position in SADC is important. It's more important probably than the AU. But in this instance, chairing the AU, you can go beyond. You can go to Cote d'Ivoire, as President Mbeki did in 2002 and elsewhere. You do have a mandate to actually weigh in on issues beyond SADC, but also maybe, again, first prize in an ideal world, say some controversial things about Zimbabwe, or put Zimbabwe on the agenda of the Peace and Security Council, which has not happened up to now. South Africa has been reluctant to stick its neck out when it comes to controversial human rights issues. Eddie Maloka writes a lot about this human rights and foreign policy, and his view is that the push for human rights on the African continent is a foreign agenda by foreign powers who are meddling on the continent and want to affect regime change. I put it out there. You can read the book. It's not well, my position. It's a very interesting, debatable point, and many of the scholars bring it back to that pivotal moment when Nelson Mandela said to the regime, Sani Abacha in Nigeria, don't hang the Ogoni Niger Delta activists, and the stance he took in the Commonwealth. And then there was this major pushback from the heads of state, and many people, Aziz Pahad and so on, have written about that. That was the moment that South Africa then said, but we can't just on a principled human rights issue stick our neck out. We are in a continent where consensus, which is the title of our policy brief, leading through consensus. We need to have consensus. We need to move behind the scenes. We need silent diplomacy. We need to bring the continent along with us. Okay, I'm going to finish. I have 4 questions that we'll see. First of all, for 2020, will South Africa prepare to stick its neck out, in some instances siding with civil society, human rights organizations? And I would like to say that I think, speakers might have another view, what happened in Sudan might have an impact on how the African Union, which is largely elitist, leadership-driven and so on, looks at the continent when it comes to peace and security, because the AU saw that ordinary people don't want Omar al-Bashir, and that maybe the AU and others should listen a bit more to ordinary people. But that's a big question mark. Are we going to listen to civil society? Number one. For this, will this whole chairing of the AU be a priority for the South African government amidst all our other issues and crises and so on? Are we going to put resources and so on in it? Then will South Africa field candidates for the Commission, which will be a good indication of, as I said, our commitment to this multilateralism? Will we also support our institutions here in South Africa, like NEPA, the APRM? South Africa will be chairing the APRM. There's this strange issue of the host country agreements that have still not been signed many years later. It seems technical, but it seems very important for people like Eddie Maloka, who I also spoke to about this. So, questions. Is this theme of silencing the guns going to be continuing throughout 2020? Are we going to, like many times in the AU, we see lofty ideals and meetings, and then sort of mid-year it fades out, and then we can't even really remember what the theme was by September, October. Is it, are we going to have sustained commitment, showcase our success stories, and really achieve something when it comes to many of the other priorities, but particularly on silencing the guns?
Thank you so much, Lizo. And we're talking a lot about what are the prerogatives of the AU chair. So I'm going to use a bit of my prerogatives as the chair of this meeting, just to make a few comments and to highlight some things back to you. I think Lizo raises a really important point, and maybe starting with the question of what can we realistically expect of South Africa. And I think the word realistic is very important, because sometimes we can think of major things that a country like South Africa could do, but in reality, how does it fit within the current structure of the chair, the current structure of the South African government and its own priorities? And I think the points that Lizo mentioned are very important, particularly the engagement of the Commission. I think many of us that work very frequently in Addis Ababa or are based in Addis Ababa know quite well that South Africa is a very active member state within the African Union, with the Permanent Representatives Council, in terms of the budgetary supports that it provides to the Union right now in around 10%, which of the regular budget is a considerable part of the budget of the African Union. But we see far less of South Africa when it comes to the Commission itself, not only in terms of the commissioners, but even when you go to lower levels within the Peace and Security Department, the Department of Political Affairs, and others. The issue around silencing the guns is then quite important, not only because it's the theme of the year, it is a milestone year for the whole project of silencing the guns and Agenda 2063 that is seen as a legacy of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma in 2013. But also, it is an agenda point of the UN Security Council itself, where South Africa plays a very prominent role as one of the 3 African members in the Council. So the question's there, and I think I'm bringing that back to you, and we can go back to the speakers on that a bit later, is how we will see this historical engagement of South Africa that uses its own experiences and own perception of what its comparative advantages in terms of moral ground, in terms of issues around mediation, in terms of engagements on the ground, but dealing with many of these challenges around perceptions. Some of the perceptions for South Africa, as well mentioned by Mohammed and Lizo, is that South Africa is an important country. South Africa is a major power within the continent, but it also has some deficiencies and challenges around how it's perceived. That being said, I wanted to use the segue to Michelle, that it's someone that is actively working with the African Union through a PSS based in Addis Ababa. But what are some of your perceptions in terms of what are the expectations for South Africa as the chair next year? What are some of the constraints? And maybe what are some of the opportunities that all of us here in this room can utilize in our engagements with the South African government and the supports that can be done both here in Pretoria and in Addis? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gustavo. And thank you for inviting me. I would like to first of all look at the context, because I believe that such a conversation can only actually give us the real sense of what South Africa will be doing when we place it into a context. And I think the 2 keywords that you use defined actually the context very, very well. I think what's going to happen, and when you talk to a number of diplomats in Addis, but also civil society organizations, think tank, you realize how important this chairship would be for a number of reasons. And I think the policy brief has really mentioned, but also dwell on a number of them. But I would like to come back first to the context, which is the 2 keywords. One is practicing decision making. The second one is consensus. And those 2 usually within the organization do not go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. So for me, what is important for South Africa, and that's what everyone would tell you, would be the tension. How South Africa will be managing the tension between the current working methods of the African Union, particularly when it comes to the Peace and Security Council, and what I call the imperative to always reach this consensus through decision making. And I think you really touch on the core of how South Africa will be working, but also how South Africa will be making a difference compared to Rwanda and compared to Egypt. If you remember, during the chairship of Rwanda, of course, President Kagame and his team were accused of imposing a number of the decision. And his response was, I need to move quick. And that's the only way. If you allow member states to comment on everything, nothing will move. And that was his argument. And in a sense, he was right. So this tension, for me, would be something that will drive the entire process during the whole year. And I think we need to be very, very aware of that and the limitation that South Africa will have based on that. Now let me look at expectation and priorities. I'm putting both together because I believe some of the expectation are priorities, and some of them will also define some of the other priorities that we would like South Africa to take on board. I think when you look at what people tell you is South Africa has to do better than Rwanda, and it has to do better than Egypt. That's the key word all the time. When you ask people, that's what they tell you. South Africa has to do better than Rwanda. And better than Rwanda, the bar is very high. If you've seen the process that Rwanda went through during its chairship. So which means the expectations are very high. Some of them said Rwanda was at 37,000 feet. South Africa should be at 42,000 feet. So that shows you the mood in Addis and the expectation and what people expect. So I think for me, priority and expectation are together, and I think economic integration, of course, is the number one. I think the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will be a top priority and should be a top priority, and that's what people actually are asking for. How South Africa, being a powerhouse, an economic powerhouse, will push this agenda forward. But more importantly, you can't have a free trade zone without dealing with labor. And it's, as South Africa is expected, actually, to really bring the question of labor into the equation. Because the next step in 2020, when the CFTA will start its implementation, the fundamental question will be labor. How do we make sure that labor can cross borders? And South Africa is expected to bring that issue on board. That's the next step. That's the next level. If we don't solve that issue, we're not going to move anywhere. And that is important. And it is linked to free movement. So those are the expectations. You can't have a free trade movement agreement, free trade zone, if you don't deal with the question of labor, labor mobility, and if you don't deal with the question of free movement. So South Africa is really expected from the Continental Free Trade Agreement to free trade zone to really work on those two issues. Of course, the other integration agenda will continue, and I think for me what is important is to look at really what Agenda 2063, reviving Agenda 2063. I think that has created a hope when Madame Zuma actually worked on this overarching framework. And people had actually the impression that after she left, then of course there was no drive anymore. Of course the priorities are there, the 10-year priorities are there, but still reference is being made to that. But you could see that some of the decisions are not speaking to the priorities of Agenda 2063. So for me, you cannot let throw the baby with the bathwater. I think it's important for South Africa to actually rebrand Agenda 2063, and I think people are also expecting that from the chairship. I also think, and this is not only my opinion, but a number of diplomats in Addis are expecting South Africa to work on the institutional reform. It has died in November. People said it's not going to come back. It's about economic integration. We're not going to come back to this reform because it's too difficult, too controversial. But people are expecting. This is the only way for this institution to reform, but not only reform, be efficient. That's what people are expecting. And not only from the CSO organization, the CSOs, or the think tank, it's also the diplomat themselves, member state themselves are expecting this organization to change, the internal governance to be more geared towards result-based, be more transparent in the delivery, and collaboration with partners be more open and more efficient. And I think for me that is another key priorities, but also expectation that South Africa has to meet. Now, let me look at the other priorities that no one mentioned, and I think you mentioned it in your introduction, but I think it's important to come back to that. Well, representing the voice of Africa in the global arena, for me, it's an important point, an important dimension. I don't think a number of people feel that South Africa, currently being member of the G20, is representing Africa. And that's very clear when you talk to people in Addis Ababa. But I think my opinion, and my humble opinion, is that it is important during this chairship. Why? Because South Africa will still be at the United Nations as a non-permanent member, but also member of the G20 and can push a number of agendas. The issue of assessed contribution for peace support operation on the continent is a topic, a contentious topic, and we need to deal with it. Africa cannot take all the burden of the conflict that we have on the continent. At the end of the day, dealing with peace and security worldwide is a global responsibility. And I think the international community has to play a part, even if Africa is making sure that funding is being mobilized, but also member states are contributing troops to deal with some of the situation on the continent. But it is important to bring that aspect that has failed in December last year in negotiating that the international community actually support the effort of Africa when it comes to peacekeeping. And peace support operation on the continent. But I also think representing Africa in the global arena means that some of the issue on free trade should be resolved. And that should be also the voice of South Africa within WTO, but also the pushback that we saw from a number of countries today about the continental free trade. So that voice is something that is very important from the chairship and is expected from South Africa as well. So lastly, I would like to look at image building. And I call it image building because I think, Lisa, you really insisted on the xenophobic attack. But I think I'm going to go a little further. I think during Madame Zuma's time, South Africa was accused of really, and people have seen Madame Zuma as the representative of South Africa and not the continental, representing the African Union at that time. And that's very painful because I think when you look at the working methods, the change of methodology, but also having a vision for the African Union, she was the only one who had brought that to the organization. But when people refer to her now, it's about, well, she worked on gender issue. She brought Agenda 2063, but she was representing South Africa and the SADC and nothing else. And I think for me that image is very important. It's not only about the xenophobic attack, it's also about coming back to that era where people have still that perception about South Africa. The second perception, I think, in terms of image building, will be to break to change the image that South Africa has brought by running for the chairship of the commission, and of course it's not a written agreement, but normally the P5 should not run for that position. And I think breaking that norm has brought a lot of discussion within the organization. And today, of course, a number of countries are thinking that we need to open the space, which is good. We are having a healthy debate about it because South Africa has started it. But a number of small countries have actually holding grievances against South Africa because of that, because it has changed then the way elections are run, and it has introduced more competition for the small country who thought that they should have the space to run the organization. So that's, I think, is also part of the image building. And in conclusion, I would like to bring a couple of issues. I think there is one particular issue for me that is very important, is leading by example. And if we look at the rate of ratification of legal instruments on the continent, for the 55 member states, I think it's important for South Africa to push that agenda forward by, of course, ratifying most of the instruments that are pending today, or really helping to move them forward and making sure that a number of countries walk the talk. I think, for me, that's an important point. The second one is aligning the priorities to the framework, the existing framework, Agenda 2063, and I talked about rebuilding the rebranding Agenda 2063 and the 14 priorities that derive from it. But also, I think it's important to look at economic integration from a different perspective. And in doing so, priorities have to be aligned to the existing framework. Currently, we have different priorities that are not speaking to those frameworks. So what is the purpose of having priorities if they don't speak to your vision, your overall vision? I think that is the role of the chairship, to recalibrate the thinking and the narrative within the organization in terms of looking at the vision and where we're heading to. The third one, I think, is rebranding Pan-Africanism. We need ideology, whether we like it or not. It's important. It keeps us grounded. And I think during Madame Zuma's time, that was something that people really appreciated. Pan-Africanism was the overarching theme. It wasn't only Agenda 2063. It was about ownership. It was about self-reliance, reducing donor dependency, making sure that Africa speaks, the voice of Africa is at the global level. And those are important. We need to have ideology. And for me, rebranding Pan-Africanism should be another priority. And of course, I will leave you perhaps with just one thought. The term of the chair of the African Union, I think for me it has to be 2 years and not 1 year. I'll let you decide during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I was here just like trying to show you a card that you had 2 minutes, but you finished spot on 15 minutes. So thank you for that. And I think Michelle really complements a lot of the thoughts that Mohammed and Lizo had put in their paper. And I wanted to bring one issue that she really highlights, which regards to the ideal representational role of the chair, but also of countries like South Africa that are playing important roles in different organizations. And I think that multiple identities of countries, of having their own national interests, the sub-regional, the continental, it always plays out, not only in Africa, but globally as well, whether a country is a member of the UN Security Council, or the G20, or BRICS, or any of these kinds of groupings and multilateral engagements. But that it's certainly interesting, and was mentioned by Michelle, particularly being a member of the UN Security Council. We've certainly seen this year South Africa playing that role, and this idea of practice of decision-making and leading by consensus, sometimes playing in favor of South Africa, and we often see AU positions being presented within the UN Security Council as part of South Africa's leverage. We saw that in the case of Sudan in June. We saw that in the case even on thematic discussions like in protection of civilians debates. But we're also seeing South Africa also having some challenges with the African Union. Most recently when it comes to the UN Security Council, Peace and Security Council meetings in Addis, when there was quite a healthy disagreement between the A3 members and the Peace and Security Council when it comes to issues around assessed contribution and financing of AU operations by the UN. And certainly the issue around economic integration, I'm looking at Aditi now, it's very timely for South Africa's foreign policy right now, with President Ramaphosa, since coming into power, presenting that at a very important priority when it comes to the role of Africa in the world, of bringing more investments, of bringing more, making South Africa more attractive to the global, within the global arena. And this issue mentioned by Michelle around labor really links to the priorities about jobs, creating jobs, increasing the economic growth of South Africa, which certainly links not only to free trade, which seems to be a priority for the country, but also the issue of free movement, which seems to be something that South Africa looks with far more caution. With that, I wanted to ask Aditi, from a South African point of view, how do we see the main foreign policy priorities of the country as we see now with many of the changes that have occurred, and what can be done in terms of South Africa's chairship next year at the Africa Union?
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Liesl, for inviting me to speak today. I think one of the benefits and pitfalls of being the last to speak is that often everything has already been said, so I'm going to sound a little bit repetitive. But hopefully, I've tried to listen in carefully on what everyone has said, and I'm going to sort of try and add just different aspects, I think, to the discussion, but on points, largely that you've already heard already. Today, when I was preparing for this, I thought, okay, the topic is, can South Africa lead the AU with consensus? And I thought there's really two elements to that question. One is actually really around South Africa's leadership, South Africa's foreign policy, South Africa's foreign policy priorities, and then the second one is obviously the manner in which it actually drives and leads on the African continent. And in the past, obviously, there's been a lot of criticism, and I think it's still relevant, around South Africa being a hegemonic big brother kind of force. And that is something that I think still plays out and is still really relevant for its leadership going into the AU, and in assuming any kind of other African leadership positions. But I want to start really with a sort of contextualization, and to build on a little bit on the context that Liesl has introduced on South Africa's foreign policy priorities currently. But I want to talk also a little bit about where we are and why we are where we are. And that is really that it's quite obvious that we're emerging from a pretty troubled decade, I think, in terms of domestic politics in South Africa. And that has had a kind of hangover effect on its foreign policy, particularly as it relates to South Africa's position on political issues, on human rights issues, on peace and security issues on the continent and in the region. And that really is I think we need to reflect a little bit about what this legacy has been of the past Zuma administration. And obviously the Mbeki administration. So Mbeki administration, we know, was now looking back on it, we can probably say it was one of the highlights of South Africa's foreign policy. It was very normative driven, very sort of aspirational, and very action oriented. It was really sort of centered around this notion of African Renaissance, the coherence of Africa and the creation of Africa's institutions through the reformation of the OAU into the AU, through the formation of NEPAD and the APRM as we know it now. But it was also, there were also spaces where Mbeki sort of fell out with the international community, where there were instances where we could sort of consider particular failures, for instance. One of them, obviously, which I think is enduring right now, and is, we could also sort of look at the Zuma administration, is Zimbabwe, quite obviously. The issue of the sort of problematic term of quiet diplomacy, and particularly President Mbeki's the perception that President Mbeki was taking sides in a Zimbabwe dialogue. The other, of course, I think was very publicly when he came up against the international community on his pronouncements on Côte d'Ivoire. And again, it's Côte d'Ivoire is going into elections next year. A lot of those issues that he was able to identify then are actually sort of are resurfacing again. in 2013, I started at SIA doing research as a researcher in December 2011. And over the course of 2013, we did a very comprehensive perception survey where we asked the diplomatic community in Pretoria, from the international community, also African and Southern African, what their perceptions of South Africa's foreign policy was. And actually very early on then, and it was really, at that point I remember, very discouraging, because I was coming as a new researcher, very optimistic and very sort of pro-African Renaissance. A lot of so one of the main findings that came out of that was that there was not a clear sense of what South Africa's foreign policy was under President Zuma. This was in 2013. And at that time, I resisted it. I was like, no, we are very sort of normative driven. We forefront, the values of our constitution are forefronted. We play an active role on peacekeeping and so on. But I think slowly, as the years have gone by, you can see that actually that there wasn't actually as much coherence in South Africa's foreign policy as there was in previous times, particularly around who made foreign policy decisions under the previous administration, who makes foreign policy decisions now. And so, there's a lot of confusion actually around where we stand on a lot of issues that seemed to have been a lot more certain, I think, in the previous administrations. So if we consider some of those challenges, Central African Republic actually being one of the main ones, was why were we in the Central African Republic? We provided a justification post facto, but it was actually not really in line with South Africa's foreign policy things. And I think people have mentioned already the positioning of campaigning for the position of the AU Chair Commission and Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. Again, that was also received with a lot of confusion. Why were we breaking this gentleman's agreement that a strong country wouldn't pursue this role? Why then did we further break the understanding that that chairmanship was going to run for two terms? She only stood for one term. I mean, and on that point as well is to say that even her tenure in the AU was quite contested during that time, right? There was a lot of resistance to the fact that South Africa was in that role, and we talk now about the fact that she was pursuing. One of the positive legacies was gender equality and the Agenda 2063. But when you were in Addis at that time, there was a lot of noise around actually the fact that she was behaving in a hegemonic, very South African, very Southern African way. Her close people were all from the region. And it was very sort of anti-African in that way. And I think that is definitely a legacy of what's going to happen for South Africa in the upcoming year. I think also, and I think this also links a little bit to Liesel's point around South Africa and the model that we present as a peace building or sort of reconciliation or mediation model. It really is. The crisis in Zimbabwe has been one that has spanned, going on to 20 years. But actually, I think the way in which the government of national unity ended in 2013, there was a lot of fatigue from the Zuma administration in 2013 around engaging with Zimbabwe, and the Zimbabwe crisis continues as a consequence. But to say that actually it's not just the GNU in Zimbabwe, it's also the political crisis in Burundi that we're not talking about quite as much because it's not receiving as much media attention. Also the political crisis in the DRC, which in some ways has sort of quietened down, even though there was a controversy around the elections. But the fact is that these were clear cases where South Africa intervened or were stepped in to assist in a peacekeeping capacity or peace building capacity, let's say, in the form of mediation, in the form of sort of negotiating, helping to assist to negotiate a settlement. And all of these cases actually reflect that the model isn't necessarily sustainable, right? And that I think warrants South Africa in many ways pushes South Africa in many ways to rethink actually what is it that what kind of model are we exporting? What is it that really worked for South Africa, and what do we want to perpetuate going forward? And I mean, just yesterday we were speaking with a delegation who was visiting from Zimbabwe, also speaking about the fact that there was a need to learn lessons from South Africa. And someone actually pointed out in that meeting that it's not necessarily the CODESA and the sort of mid-1990s, bringing parties together that is the only model to focus on. There was a lot of background stuff that started happening in the 1970s and the 1980s, where that was the real quiet diplomacy that took place, where there was meetings taking place between the apartheid government, between F.W. de Klerk and the ANC, that nobody really knew about, but that actually was the foundation for what brought you to the 1990s. And I think so we need to have discussions around actually what is the model that we need to be thinking about. And I think to say also that there's also concomitant to this, I think, in the past, in the recent past, has been, I think, a failure of SADC. I'm very maybe failure is a bit strong a word, but I do think that there's there hasn't been as much commitment from the side of SADC in the realm of peace and security, in the realm of intervening in the conflicts in the region in a manner that actually is representative of the human rights issues and the issues of citizens, I think. And then I think that brings me really to the kind of South Africa that President Ramaphosa has inherited, the kind of government that he's inherited. And obviously that is, as we've said, really sort of plagued by the corruption scandals that I have, the Zondo that are coming out in the Zondo Commission, the issues of the Guptas, the Bosasas, and so on. And I think this is really also framed by the impending flirtation with recession versus stagnation in our economy, and a declining sort of global confidence in South Africa's performance. Concomitant to this, I think, is there's a reduced commitment from the South African side in terms of how it is being able to deploy resources for peacekeeping, peace and security issues on the continent. So on the one hand is obviously the declining resources in terms of our budget spend to defense. Consistently over the past 25 years, the South African Defence Forces has been receiving less and less funding every year, and we're actually at a point of crisis. There was a 2015 defence review that took place that actually said in order for the Defence Forces to be effectively deploy, in and amongst the fact that there needs to be a sort of organizational rethink about the way in which our defense forces are constructed. There needs to be a minimum of 1% GDP spend on defense, and that's not, I mean, I think this last budget we received 20 billion rand, which is a negligible amount of money. So actually the capacity of South Africa to be able to engage on humanitarian issues already is also diminishing. I'm nowhere near where I wanted to be in terms of my timing, but so I think we have to think about that, and as Gustavo mentioned, how realistic it is that we expect that South Africa can play a peacekeeping sort of role on the continent. And I think sort of to go back to sort of South Africa's current priorities, which is really around economic development, economic diplomacy, promoting investment, and promoting the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We're losing actually the emphasis on the political, the humanitarian, the peace and security element. And I know that this is a theme that is going to be raised in the African Union through next year's theme. But my point is I think I don't see what the grounding is currently that we can take from our domestic experience to be able to propel to a continental level. So for if I can explain a little bit what I mean by this. You saw in the early 2000s South Africa's commitment to the African Renaissance. It really actually pushed us in this leadership role in transforming the OAU into the African Union, into creating these institutions at a continental, at a regional level. You saw also when we were in the UN Security Council, our first time in the UN Security Council was when we actually initiated the need to improve relations between the UN Security Council and the AU Peace and Security Council. I don't see that there are innovative, new, different initiatives that are coming out of South Africa's foreign policy where we are right now that we are projecting in any of these forums. And so, again, it's mixed with this, the notion of xenophobia. The fact that we have all of these really pressing domestic constraints has forced us to start thinking more internally. And in consequence, I think the effect that it has had is that our foreign policy in many ways is one of just, to use a sort of popularism, is meh, right? Like it's just, it's neither, it really is just a case of continuing the status quo. It's one of stasis. It's not really one of innovation, one of leadership, one of pushing for sort of a real sort of African agenda. And I think maybe just leave it at that, and hopefully we'll get your questions from there.
Thank you so much, Aditi. And I think having the four speakers definitely does not give me a meh feeling about what was shared this morning. And I thought what was interesting from Aditi's presentation, that it comes back to this idea of not how could or what would be, what is the potentials, but it's going back to this question of can South Africa actually lead through consensus at the African Union? And I thought it was quite interesting bringing this idea of what is the manner in which South Africa will do it, what is the particular space, but also how will South Africa deal with maybe its ghost of past Christmas in terms of the legacy, the engagements, the challenges that we faced in the last couple of years. But one of the issues that we often speak here in Pretoria is about what is the engagement right now of South Africa. Is South Africa back in the game? And if it is back in the game, what game is South Africa playing internationally and regionally? And that leads to questions around where South Africa is engaging with its own region, whether it's through SADC or Zimbabwe, but also how South Africa will engage with this number of initiatives that we see regionally and globally through a capable bureaucracy, through DIRCO, but also particularly the embassy in Addis Ababa, but also in terms of the role of the president himself and the minister herself. So that being said, I would like to close the open part of the seminar. And on that, I would like to thank our colleagues that are following us online. And we will start a closed discussion, Chatham House rules, immediately after. Thank you very much.